Over the summer, I got an invite to a cocktail reception at a museum, and my first thought was somebody made a mistake. Cocktail reception in a museum sounds like the kind of thing you go to when you're one of Gotham's wealthy elite and you want to dress fancy, eat hors d'oeuvres, and get menaced by the Riddler. Whereas I am a goblin that subsided for years entirely on Hot Pockets and White Castle. Fun fact, the original slider has 140 calories. But if you have IBS like I do, it takes about 150 to push it out. I'm a fat girl now, but that's only because I started eating healthy. Take that, nutritionists. That's the kind of sophistication and class that I would bring to a cocktail reception at a museum.
Hello.
What is that?
It appears to be a vulgar low comedian.
So of course I went. It was held at the Vonnegut Museum in Indianapolis to celebrate the release of the author's long-lost board game, GHQ. And I know what you're thinking. Amabel, did you drive all the way from Detroit to Indianapolis and back again just to crash a fancy party? Yes, I don't get out much. I don't go places or do things. I don't even go to conventions, which is unusual for someone in the board game industry. It's gone to the point where people stop asking me if I'm going to Gen Con this year because they know the answer is no. Why would I do that? That sounds terrible. I don't even know when Gen Con is. So I make the drive to the Vonnegut Museum, and it turns out a cocktail party is not really that fancy, and there's no sign of the Riddler. I actually recognize a lot of the other attendees because they're all here for Gen Con. And they ask me, Amabel, oh gosh, you're at Gen Con? No. Why would I go to Gen Con? That sounds terrible. Okay, so did you drive here just for this party? Yes, that's a normal thing to do. I don't know why people keep asking me this. Vonnegut designed the game in 1956. This is 5 years after his first novel, Player Piano, flopped. So at this time, Vonnegut is struggling to support his family. He tried his hand at running a car dealership and it was pretty disastrous. So he thinks, I keep failing at everything. How am I going to make a lot of money? I know, I'll design a hit board game. But he failed to get a publisher. 3 years later, his second novel, Sirens of Titan, is a modest success, and 10 years after that, Slaughterhouse-5 makes him a household name. Now, years after Vonnegut's death, game designer Jeff Engelstein reads about the game and thought, I'd like to publish that. Time for some disclosure. In addition to being a publisher, game designer, and writer, Jeff is also the editor of the Guides to Tabletop Game Design, a series of monographs from the CRC Press, a division of Routledge, which is a prominent publisher in the academic world. And Jeff asked me to write a book in this series, and I did. So Jeff isn't just some guy, he's the editor of my book, which is coming out in January. You can buy it if you want. It is $150. That's just hardcover. You can get it in paperback or Kindle, where it's only $60. This is standard pricing in the academic world, which is why I don't own any of these books. If I had that kind of money, I would get robbed by the Riddler. Jeff was kind enough to take some time out of his day and talk to me about GHQ.
I found out that his papers were all at Indiana University. So this was probably like around 2011, 2012, something like that. And then, so I reached out to them to see if if they knew of anything. And then they looked and they said, yeah, we do actually have some boxes that are board game materials, but we can't release anything without permission from the family. So you need to talk to them. But I mean, that whole process took maybe a year or two. I mean, it was just, it's just slow getting responses going, finding people, etc. So that was kind of, how I found out about it, and ultimately, was able to get my hands on the papers. It was like 5 or 6 different versions of the rules in the in the package that I got, and nothing was dated, so I had to do some detective work to kind of put them in chronological order, figure out what was the most recent ones, and and basically figured out ultimately how to play, or how I think he intended it to be played in its best possible form.
These notes are reproduced in the finished game along with Jeff's commentary.
The notes were the crux of the project, right? I mean, I didn't want to just publish as a board game because, like I said, it wasn't just trying to make money, and it wasn't, it was a good game. I don't know if you've had a chance to play
I
it,
did.
but I mean, yeah, it's good, but I mean, it's not, it's not going to light the world on fire. But the fascinating part is, like, in the context of his is that historical context of his anti-war with this, and kind of on him coming. This is I really consider this a step of his on his journey to grappling with the PTSD that he suffered and experiences that he had at Dresden.
Yeah.
And this is like a halfway point, this game, between him having being in Dresden and writing Slaughterhouse Five. So, I think it's just fascinating from that standpoint. So if you don't look at it in that context, then it's just that's what gives it the meaning.
And this is something I think is really interesting. I'm not talking about this game because of how it plays. The game is not the selling point. The selling point is the cultural object. The selling point is Kurt Vonnegut made a board game. Now, this might not seem unusual. There are absolutely games that are sold on the reputation of their designers. Oh, there's a new Lacerda? What's your favorite Rosenberg? I myself only have a career where I make weird, frustrating art piece games because there is an Alturas streak in the modern hobby market. But we still sell them as games first and foremost, on their merits as ludic objects. If the game doesn't sound compelling, no one's going to buy it, no matter whose name is on the box. It's worth noting that GHQ isn't being pitched at that hobby market. It's being sold exclusively through Barnes & Noble, the largest bookseller in the United States. In fact, it wasn't until earlier this year that Barnes & Noble started listing the names of game designers on their website, identifying them as authors. This was due to the efforts of the Tabletop Game Designers Association. Jeff is the president of this nonprofit advocacy group. Some of their goals include standardizing licensing and royalties across an industry that's often been very not standardized, preservation of games and their history, and convincing large mainstream outlets to list designers as authors. Listing designers as authors is one way we frame board games as being works of art. And here I'm using the word art specifically just to mean the kind of thing it is, not to talk about the quality of that thing. And honestly, this is where selling what is a pretty mid-abstract game as a lost work by Kurt Vonnegut is rhetorically significant. You would play GHQ in the same spirit that you would read a book like Timequake. It's not essential Vonnegut, it's not his best work. That would be Slaughterhouse 5 or Breakfast of Champions. It's not even my favorite Vonnegut. Shout out to all my fellow Happy Birthday 1 to June fans out there.
There are dozens of us.
It reminds me of this 3-disc Criterion release of Mr. Arcaden. Arcaden?
So sure your name is Arcada.
Huh?
Well, maybe it's Arcadine or Arcadini or Archipopoulos or Smithy.
This is probably the worst film Orson Welles made. Certainly the worst one to be released in his lifetime. The script was cobbled together based on 3 episodes of The Adventures of Harry Lime, a radio show where Welles played his character from The Third Man. He was kicked out of the editing room, and there were 4 different cuts of the film floating around, with runtimes ranging from 93 to 99 minutes. In 2006, a reconstructed version of the film was cut together to approximate the film Welles intended, and that runs 105 minutes. This Criterion release includes this cut of the film, alongside 2 others, clips from the Spanish language version, the Harry Lime episodes, a documentary about the new version. It's a really comprehensive package for a film that is bottom tier Welles. There is so much love and craft and passion in it for a film that at best is watchable, but I didn't buy this because I thought this was going to be a film I was going to fall in love with. I bought it because my brain finds all this context fascinating. That's the same reason I bought GHQ. I get to look at Vonnegut's papers. I get to read Jeff's annotations. That's really cool. I can't think of another game that's ever done this. Like, I would love to have a copy of Acquire that reprints Sid Sackson's design notes. The closest we get in board games are the historical supplements that come with war games, designer notes, notes for the cards and CDGs. Fort Circle Games goes above and beyond, including these neat replicas of historical documents. Like GHQ, these games are packaged with additional context to frame our appreciation of the game. But where it differs is that the supplements in historical games frame them as history, as educational tools. The supplements in GHQ, on the other hand, focus on the artistic process, where this game fits in Vonnegut's canon, and what was going on in his life while he designed it. The game has an introduction by the authors of the book series The Expanse, and I have never heard of a celebrity author writing an introduction for a board game. This happens with books all the time. It's a way to frame the work as serious or significant. For example, the first folio of Shakespeare's plays, published 7 years after his death, had an introduction by fellow playwright Ben Jonson. Shakespeare's plays have been continually in print for the last 400 years, and this includes a number of critical editions, authoritative versions of the text accompanied by essays, analysis, and annotations. Probably the best of these is the Norden Shakespeare, now in his third edition. I mean, look at this. There are footnotes and glosses in the margin. Each play has an introduction, analysis of the play as a work of art, and also the textual history, notes on the various variations, plus performance notes.
Holy shit, I'm gonna come.
So I realize not everyone is as hot for textual criticism as I am, but this act of putting together an authoritative edition with an introduction, annotations, looking at different variations and drafts, providing all this kind of primary source documents, it has a rhetorical purpose, and that is to say that this work is worthy of that kind of analysis and attention. And when it's published commercially, offered for the public to buy, it assumes that there is a public that wants to buy it. It's not necessarily a huge audience. Like, the general public isn't going to shell out $40 for a middling film from the 50s that's pretty obscure. People have Shakespeare in their homes. It's probably not the Norden Shakespeare. I looked this up. It'd be like $100+ just to get this in paperback. I don't have that kind of money. That's Riddler money. I had to borrow this from my library, who had to borrow it from a different library that could actually afford it. There is a way in which these kind of contextualized objects exist as bougie signifiers of class and education. What's fascinating about GHQ is that it is that kind of contextualized object, but is being sold and marketed to the general public. It's making this argument about games being art and being worthy of this kind of attention, but it's making that argument to normal people and not like core hobby gamers. In fact, hobby gamers have kind of ignored it. There are only like 25 comments and about as many ratings on BGG, and that's nuts for a game that's gotten so much media coverage and has sold thousands and thousands of copies. But this isn't surprising. GHQ was designed 70 years ago, and it feels like it. It feels old. And BGG's user base is really more focused on the new and the now. Last month, I did a little video for Antoine Walbrook's birthday and mentioned some of my friends bouncing off of the Red Shoes, one of my favorite films. They found the acting and writing of this film from the 40s hard to connect with. I got a couple of comments on that video that were pretty snide towards my friends. One said that they needed to broaden their horizons, and I disagree really strongly with that. Those friends have extremely adventurous tastes, are very receptive to new experiences, new voices, able and willing and eager to meet new things where they are. And that's kind of the way I think about hobby gamers. There's a lot of exciting, innovative work being done right now, and hobby gamers are usually open to it. There's not really a lot of nostalgia for creaky old games, and that's healthy. At the same time, I look at something like this replica of the 1963 edition of Clue, which admittedly is pitched more at that mass market audience that has that nostalgia. It has this really colorful, attractive, distinctive art, and I wish a little booklet came with it that would put that art in the context of its time, in the context of earlier and later editions of the game, the way the game has been updated to meet mainstream tastes as they evolve over the decades. I wish it told me who the artist was. As near as I can tell, no one knows. I wish it listed the designer. We can find that out really easily, but it's not here. Because the point of this replica isn't really preservation or context. It's kitsch. If preserving something says this thing matters, not preserving it says this thing doesn't. I know it's not as simple as that, though, so I decided to talk to some people who work in preservation to get some different perspectives. I already talked to Jeff, who preserved GHQ for a commercial release for the public. I also talked to someone who works at a museum, someone who works at a university, and an amateur.
So my name's Jake Hildebrandt. I'm the manager of the Historic Operating Machinery Department at the Henry Ford.
I'm Henry Lowood. I'm the Harold C. Hobach Curator at Stanford University.
My name is Raleigh Harlock, and I am an amateur archivist. I don't do this for any sort of corporation or company. I archive things merely out of passion.
I'm responsible for the History of Science and Technology collections and the Film and Media collections, and I run a sort of an archival center at Stanford called the Silicon Valley Archives. That's probably most of what I do these days.
So most of my work is larger machinery in Greenfield Village and the museum. It's basically, we say it's everything that's not a car or a train that gets used and is old. So our responsibilities include the carousel, the printing presses, the looms, the farm equipment, the carriages.
I archive for various formats like Laserdisc and VHS, and even things like the PSP format known as the UMD, Universal Media Disc. And what got me interested in these kinds of things is that I would receive different versions of movies, whether it be a DVD, a Blu-ray, and now 4Ks, and I'll notice things will be missing, things could be changed, color gradings could be wrong, DNR is a thing, different audio mixes, different cuts as well, and a lot of those tend to be locked to those old analog formats that don't get ported over.
In college, truthfully, I got into steampunk. It was a small online community, and I had a knack for making things that fit that bill, and I liked it. And kind of thinking of where to go with that professionally, and this was 2008, 2009, when jobs were very hard to come by, and all the normal engineering jobs were, you had to have like years of unpaid internships to get a chance, and I didn't grow up knowing anybody in that field, so it kind of felt impossible. So I kind of thought, well, if it's gonna be this weird and tricky to get into the normal job, I might as well find a weird little niche that's my thing. And it just kind of came to me about museums, interactive display kind of stuff. So I started looking at grad schools for museum stuff, and in doing so, in those classes and internships, I found that I really liked a lot of the more preservation side of things, the registrars, which is cataloging and tracking artifacts. And so for a while I worked in archives and in collections management.
We were the first, I've been at Stanford forever. We were the first to collect historical software, a collection of historical software.
Okay.
We did that in the late 90s. The tabletop games part of it is relatively recent, and that's, I think, true for most places around the country, that strangely collecting digital games came first, and then tabletop games have sort of come in later. I think that's interesting, and maybe that's something we can talk about later. So we've just in the last year or two started to identify tabletop games as a collection focus, meaning putting all the pieces together from acquisition through cataloging and access in the library as a new program.
A friend and I created an entire server dedicated to archiving just the UMD video format. So our job is essentially to rip the ISO file from the UMD and archive the art, which is another important one. A lot of these physical releases have art either done by artists or, done out of stuff from materials that the company gave them. And when people choose to rip these files, they don't keep the art. They essentially just give you the file and that's it. Our goal is to essentially keep everything intact.
Here's a newspaper clipping with an ad for that item. Here's a page from a collector's guide that's got 6 other vases that kind of look like that. We'll put that in there.
Are you asking like historical context for how, like, where the art was created, like who made it, who did this, who did that?
Do you get that kind of information and record it?
Sometimes, yes.
And just to combine as much as we know about this thing in this one spot, so you can pull that out and say, this is everything we know about this.
A copy of Stalingrad, the Avalon Hill game, that has correspondence from the 1960s from play-by-mail games of the MIT Game Simulation Society members. And so you open the Stalingrad game box, and I make the joke I would never actually do this. I said I feel like throwing the map and the rule book like off in the corner and just digging into these letters that are all in there. With the old PBM forms and the new, the stock table, cutting out the stock tables to do the die rolls and all that. Yeah.
There is some amount of kind of archaeological context to it, and that, you're looking through this folder and you see that these 2 newspaper clippings are next to each other in there between a bunch of written documents or something. You can intuit that, well, those 2 were probably put in at the same time by, probably by the same person or whatever.
There are very few libraries right now where there's somebody who'll tell you, I'm at I'm Stanford Libraries and I'm collecting board games. You won't find too many people who would say that. Part of that is cultural and institutional. I would say in part that the institutional decision makers haven't caught up to the fact that there's a lot going on in board game design these days. It took a while. I went through this whole thing with digital games. It took about 10 years. Now it's a pretty well accepted thing that there are quite a few institutions that are collecting video games and computer games, but it took years to get to that point. So I'm having to be very selective at this point because the amount of money I can spend on this is relatively limited compared to other things that I buy, other areas I buy in. Now, so my selectivity, and I as a selector am biased. My background lifelong really is in what I call nonfiction games. So I only play war games, sports games, and historical games.
For me, I choose stuff that is more obscure or not readily available, even if it's something from a mainstream series. The craziest one is Warriors of the Wind.
This is an English language version of Nausicaa that was so badly butchered, Miyazaki said, you know what? Distributors don't get to edit my films anymore.
And in this valley, a spirited princess named Zandra dedicates herself to a tomorrow of peace and joy and hope.
That there was a UMD video release, and I actually thought it was a bootleg originally, but I was very wrong. It does exist, and I managed to get one from France, and it is now completely preserved. These are movies that people want to be forgotten. Warriors of the Wind, by a lot of people, is considered a bad dub, so why preserve it? Well, it's still important. It's still a factor in the film's popularity. It's still one of the earliest forms of anime coming to America in a wide setting.
I know in particular the war game area really well. So I'm really confident I can say this is an important game. We need to have this. We have Catan, we have a copy of it somewhere, but I'm not tracking down even though that's probably the first game people would think of, maybe, at least on a college campus. I'm not interested in tracking down every variant or version of it. And then as you get into more, let's say, family and traditional games, that sort of thing, there isn't really a research aspect that I can explain to somebody else, as opposed to the games, like I mentioned, I'm having to be a little bit tactical in like how I operate within an institution which hasn't collected these sorts of things before. Not that there's been any objection; it's been pretty supportive, but still, it's a new thing and have to work into it slowly. The attention to these issues and their connection with other things going on campus, whether it's at the student level, student groups and student culture, or research that's being done, and driven by topic and designer to a certain extent. I'm not trying to be comprehensive. I'm really trying to focus on the things I think will be most interesting for teaching and research at Stanford. I'll mention that for the Silicon Valley archives, we got quite a big gift a few years ago. So the resources available for our program and staff are better than they were. And as a result of that, I determined that the sort of priority over the next 10 years was going to be focusing on hitherto underdocumented communities and underdocumented topics. And
Preservation efforts are driven by the passions and interests of the people doing the work. But when you're working within an institution, you're further limited by their interest. It has to demonstrate a practical value in line with their values. Working outside the system, you're not as restrained, except that you often have fewer resources to work with.
So I think another thing too is getting access to equipment. Unfortunately, as we've talked about it being a capitalistic hellscape out there, not everyone is going to have the means to restore things. I think the thing people need to realize is no piece of media is unimportant. No video format is unimportant. If you don't like it, that's your opinion. But that doesn't mean it's not worthy of being saved. All art deserves to be preserved.
But does all art deserve to be preserved? Do we really need to preserve super babies, baby geniuses too, for future generations?
Cain knew if he could control the children, he could control the world. He even captured children trying to escape through the Berlin Wall and sent them to his secret camps all over East Germany.
It's the last film from director Bob Clark, best known for A Christmas Story. His first film was She-Man, a 1967 exploitation film in which a sadistic transvestite blackmails a man into cross-dressing and taking hormones, forcing him to be her maid. And it's hard for me to argue for the preservation of this. She-Man is about an hour long, so it was released alongside a 30-minute documentary. Queens at Heart sees 4 trans women interviewed about their lives. The questions from a cis straight guy are quite invasive and prurient, and given the language of the time, these women are framed and dismissed as being a weird flavor of homosexual man.
When you go to business, do you dress in a dress like that or a skirt and sweater? What do you usually wear?
I usually wear a white shirt, tie, sports jacket.
Are those your own eyelashes?
No.
And Sonia, is that your own hair?
No.
But these 4 women get to actually talk about their lives. And they say things I've said. They feel things I've felt.
Yes, I was an outsider.
Were you the butt of jokes and barbs from the other children?
Yes.
What would they say?
There goes the fairy, there goes Little Miss Wonder.
And this upset you?
Yes.
Was there anybody in those early days that you could talk to and tell about how you felt?
No, not until just about a year ago. I met people like me. I thought I was the only one. And it's a little easier now.
These are women who were born around the same time as my grandmother. It's a potent reminder that we were always here. Every time I've seen Queens at Heart, I've cried.
Do you have any brothers or sisters?
I have an older brother.
Does he know that you're homosexual?
No.
What do you think he'd do if he found out?
Probably kill me.
And the only reason why I got to see it, got to cry those tears, is because in the 90s, film preservationist Jenny Olson found one of the few surviving prints. And in 2009, the film was restored through the UCLA, and in 2021, they put it on YouTube so that anyone can see it. Anyone can be moved by it. Anyone can be enriched by it. And isn't that what preserving art is all about? Do you run at all into any kind of legal complications with the archiving? Are there software
Yes.
okay.
Yes. Absolutely.
The art forms which rose to prominence in the 20th century revolve around expensive technologies that most people don't have the financial resources to access. Corporations did, however, and the result was a century of corporate art. Now, there were exceptions all along, and in the 21st century, this has been shifting as these technologies become more affordable and more accessible to more people. But as a general rule, when most people think about films, television, video games, board games, they're thinking about art made by a corporation. Or to be more precise, art made by talented people working with that corporation's resources. The company owns the means by which the things are produced. That's a good phrase. It's almost there. Someone should workshop that. And as a result, they own the art itself. And they pay the people who actually make the thing as little as possible, keeping the rest. This is like let's call it the surplus value generated by that labor. And none of this is to say that works of art created in this way are automatically bad, any more than works created independently are free of compromises. They're not. Studio films and AAA games can be beautiful and moving works of art. But because they're made using a corporation's resources, they also, and perhaps primarily, need to serve that corporation's interest, the interest of all corporations, making money.
There is only one holistic system of systems. One vast and immane, interwoven, interacting, multivariate, multinational dominion of dollars.
I'm not going to belabor this point because you live on the planet Earth. You already know this is how a business looks at art. If it's making money, it's good. It's important. If it isn't making money, it's not. And I'm choosing my grammatical tense very carefully here. Because if the art made money then, but doesn't make money now, not even to the small niche crowd that's into old things, it's no longer good. It's no longer important. It no longer needs to be saved. For example, with the advent of the talking motion picture, there was not a lot of demand for old silent films. Many film studios just destroyed their old films to save on storage costs. The Library of Congress estimates something like 70% of American silent films are lost forever. It also used to be common when a film wasn't profitable for the company to allow the copyright to lapse. It's a Wonderful Life, it is my favorite Christmas movie, do not at me, was a huge flop on its initial release, and so it went to the public domain. It then got a ton of showings on television because there were no royalties to pay. Familiarity made it popular, and the studio was like, oh, we can make money from this. It is now good. It is now important. So they used a goofy loophole to reestablish their copyright, which is definitely a thing they should be allowed to do.
I've suddenly become quite important.
These companies value the art they own based on its ability to make a buck. And on a subconscious level is kind of how most of us do it as well. It's how we've been taught to do it. You ever been in a dollar store and look through the DVD bin and you come across some movie you've never heard of, put out by some fly-by-night company with packaging that looks like it was slapped together in MS Paint in 5 minutes, and you just dismiss the thing because if it was a good movie, you would have heard of it and it would have been put out by a real company.
Let's go, old man.
As an example, let me talk about this artifact. Robert De Niro double feature Born to Win and The Swap, 2 films on 1 DVD. It has interactive menus, original graphics, facts and trivia, in this economy? Plus, chapters - direct scene access parentheses go straight to your favorite scenes. Both films feature a pre-stardom De Niro in minor roles. Sort of. So the swap came out in 1979, by which point De Niro was a big deal. What happened is that De Niro had been in another film, Sam's Song, which came out in 1969, and the film studio said, what if we took some of that footage and shoot a new film around it to trick people into thinking there's a new De Niro film? That's the swap's whole deal. It's not good, and unsurprisingly, De Niro wasn't thrilled about this. The other film is Born to Win. This is from 1971 and is the second film directed by Ivan Passer, best known at the time for his collaborations with fellow Czech New Waver Miloš Forman. De Niro's in it for like 4 minutes playing a cop. He gets 5th billing and doesn't even get his own title card. The real lead is George Segal, playing a charming, manipulative schemer whose addiction to heroin leads to self-destruction. Though that makes it sound like he doesn't have agency. More than once, he knows, oh, robbing this mubbed up drug dealer, this is a bad idea. This is going to get me killed, and he does it anyway. He's given chances to wiggle free of it, and instead chooses every opportunity to double down. Born to Win has a lot of really wild tonal shifts, but is overall pretty downbeat. It was filmed under the title Scraping Bottom, and was set to release a few months after Panic in Needle Park, another film about heroin addiction. And the studio wanted to stand out from that film. They felt it would make more money if it had an upbeat title. It didn't. Audiences hated it, reviews weren't kind either, and so they let it fall into the public domain. Sometime in the 90s, it gets paired with The Swap as a Robert De Niro double feature, in a pretty abysmal transfer cropped to fit 4:3 televisions. And this crop is pretty careless. Some of the people in the opening credits don't even get their full name on the screen. Poor Han Swanso. But that's basically all you can expect from a release that's trying to trick you into thinking it stars Robert De Niro. This did, however, allow the film to be rediscovered. Among its fans are the Safdie brothers, who cited it as a direct influence on their film Uncut Gems. You thought I was just being gross with that clip earlier, but it was actually foreshadowing. Just a couple years ago, Born to Win was released on Blu-ray for the first time. This comes from Fun City Editions, a partner of Vinegar Syndrome. It has a beautiful 2K restoration and a really informative commentary track, plus one of those little booklets you get with these kind of boutique label releases. Turns out that guy's name is Swanson. That makes sense. Falling into the public domain saved this film, just like it did It's a Wonderful Life. Thank goodness this is how companies deal with something that doesn't make money. It'd be terrible if they just destroyed the art when it wasn't profitable, or if they destroyed it because they decided it'd be more profitable as a tax write-off. Can you imagine?
It wasn't as amusing as you might think.
Criminals aren't ever very amusing.
It's because they're failures. Those who make real money aren't counted as criminals. This is a class distinction.
In the United States, works enter the public domain 70 years after the death of the author. In the case of works made by a corporation, which is functionally immortal, they will enter the public domain in 95 years after publication, or 120 years after creation, whichever comes first. So a film like Coyote vs. Acme, which has been created but is not going to be released, well, you'll be able to get your hands on it and see it'll be in the public domain in 120 years, if there are any copies. We don't know if there are. That show you liked on that streaming service that they then pulled because it was too queer, you'll be able to see it in 95 years, again if any copies exist. And all this is just talking about works where we know who owns it, because it turns out there are a lot of things where we just kinda don't.
That we decided we were just going to bypass the legal interpretation side of this and contact rights holders directly. So we set up this project. You can imagine these are thousands of titles. We did sort of a long tail approach. You could imagine like Activision, Microsoft, those kinds of companies are on the left with lots and lots of titles, and the tail goes down to all of these entities that published one title in 1986, that kind of thing. Even when we had a game that said copyright Electronic Arts, let's say, when we copied Electronic Arts, when we contacted them, they came back to us and said, we can't answer your question about giving you permission to provide access online, for example, because we're not sure if we own the rights to it. And we'd say, well, it's copyright Electronic Arts. And they would say, well, yes, but things happen, like we can't find the paperwork, we can't find the original contract, or there's music in the game that was licensed for 10 years, or yes, but the rights reverted to the original developer after 20 years. Things like that. A lot of scenarios that we hadn't even thought about. We've sent letters out for maybe 3,000, 4,000 of the maybe 15,000 or so titles. So far, we've cleared 20 titles, which cleared means world access, world download. We put it upload, anybody can look at it.
Now, board games are unusual here in a couple of respects. No, I didn't forget this video was about board games. Look, we're 40 minutes in. This is video essay number 10. You should know my deal by now. I'm like that little shit from the Family Circus with the dotted lines. Board games are unusual here in a couple of respects. First, you can't really copyright a board game. The art and the specific wording used are subject to copyright. In some cases, the mechanisms can be patented. The name can be trademarked, and as long as the name continues to be used, the trademark does not expire. So while you could publish a game that plays like Monopoly, and in 2030, after the original art falls into the public domain, you could use that art. You couldn't sell it under the name Monopoly, which is trademarked. The other way board games are unusual is that there are these two distinct markets which work very differently. In the hobby market, the designer is treated like an author. Your name is on the box. You license the game to a publisher, and theoretically those rights can revert to you. Sometimes it's not as simple as that, and this is one of those areas that the TTGDA wants to work to standardize. The mass market, on the other hand, treats designers as inventors. You sell your game to a publisher, or they hire you to create the game for them. This market is dominated in the United States by toy companies Hasbro and Mattel, who have themselves eaten up other toy companies like Parker Brothers, Milton Bradley, and Fisher-Price, who themselves ate up other toy companies, who ate up other toy companies, which can make who has the rights to this old game and what rights do they have a murky question. Sometimes, like with those big video game companies, not even the people who are supposed to own it know whether or not they own it. I know of at least one old school designer who reached out to one of these big companies about a game he did for a company they bought and was told they couldn't find the paperwork. One of the defunct companies on this chart is the E.S. Lowe Company. It was founded by Edwin S. Lowe, a traveling salesman, who took folk games like Beano and Yacht and, after making some improvements, marketed them as Bingo and Yahtzee. Lowe sold the company to Milton Bradley in 1973 for $26 million. Lowe released several other games, among them Ad-Lib crossword cubes, also known as Scribbage and Word Mix. That's the Dutch version. It had several editions throughout the 60s and 70s and was reasonably popular, though is pretty much forgotten today. In 1976, now a subsidiary of Milton Bradley, the company released a spin-off game, Duplicate Ad-Lib Crossword Cubes. It's a two-player only version, and if it was released today, it'd probably be called Ad-Lib Crossword Cubes Duel. More like Dual-Plicate. I talked about this game in a previous video. It's not a masterpiece. It's not revolutionary. But it's a clever design that I really admire. It only got a single printing, so my assumption is it didn't sell very well. As a result, it's been forgotten. And over time, copies will become more scarce, and then it just won't exist anymore. If I wanted to preserve this game, how would I do it? I could preserve the idea. You shake this box, and it randomizes the position of the dice, but doesn't allow them to change their facing, so you're handing your opponent the same puzzle that you just solved. I could build a whole new game around this idea. Not a word game, but something else. That's not really preservation, though. That's just normal game design. That's just art. We borrow and we build.
Take your clothes off. What? Take your clothes off.
Take his clothes off.
Everything.
Don't worry about it. Get in the club. No, I want the underwear. No.
Maybe someone could reprint this. It wouldn't sell very well. It didn't the first time around. So Hasbro's not going to do it. And don't look at me. Custom dice cost a lot for print on demand. 26 custom dice? No thank you. And then there's the whole legal issue. I had a whole section about the legalities of printing a game from 50 years ago whose trademark has been abandoned, but you know what? I am a trans woman a week out from 2025. I really don't care about whether or not something is legal, just whether or not it is right.
Ladies and gentlemen, the reason for using first names only for these very, very charming contestants is that right now, each one of them is breaking the law.
And when I talk about preserving this game, I'm not really talking about the game as a ludic object, because, you know, it's fine. I like it a lot, but it is a 5-minute filler word game for 2 players. There's a reason why I've locked.
It's a good game. I don't know if you've had a chance to play it, but I mean, it's good, but it's not, you know, it's not going to light the world on fire. But the fascinating part is, like, in the context of is that historical context.
What I'm interested in is the context. There was a whole slew of weird gimmicky word games in the 70s that did not go anywhere, and that's really interesting. What was that all about? I think it's really clever the way someone took the dice and the scoring rules from ad-lib crossword cubes and added a couple dingy boxes to it, and oh, I guess we have a new game now. I think it's really charming that both games just use the same cups from Yahtzee with a different sticker slapped on it. That's what I want to preserve. I want to tell you about the person who came up with those boxes and why and how they thought them up. Were they a ad-lib crossword cube superfan? Were they an employee of Milton Bradley? Did they pitch this to their bosses? Or did the boss come in and say, hey, we need a new ad-lib crossword cubes game, what do you got? I have no idea what the story is, and I'm trying to find it out. I'm doing honest-to-gosh research. It's been 100% dead end so far, but I'm still at it. I want to know who the designer is, just like I want to know who did the art for the 1963 Clue.
Our goal is to essentially keep everything intact, preserve as much as possible, because, like it or not, physical media is rotting. Even stuff made commercially is going to rot as we speak. We have plenty of early DVDs and even some early Blu-rays that are no longer playable due to oxidation. Laserdisc is the same way. A lot of glue that bound sides together are fading, and there's nothing you can do about it.
Now, board games are pretty durable. They're not rotting, at least not at the same rate as those discs are. But their history is slipping away. There are thousands of games published in the 20th century without credited designers, because the companies that published them did not see the games as art, did not see the people who made them as artists. Some of those people are still alive, or their children are, but at a certain point in the near future, they won't be. And then that information will be irretrievably lost. And maybe you're like, well, what does that matter? These are all old, junky games. No one's life is going to be made better by having access to Topple. The thing is, though, it doesn't really matter what we think. We don't preserve things for ourselves. We preserve them for the people who come after us. In the 30s and 40s, people said, why should we save these old silent films? No one's going to want to see these. But I can tell you, nearly 100 years later, Some people do. I'm one of them. My life has been made better. My heart has been made fuller by having access to minor works that someone somewhere decided to preserve. If we have a duty to preserve and contextualize our history and our art and our culture for future generations, then that includes the junk, the ordinary alongside the remarkable.
All art deserves to be preserved.
Going forward, I'm going to be spending some of my free time trying to fill in some of these blanks, find out who made these things, find out their stories if it's possible, preserve as much of it as I can while there is still time. And at the moment, looking at it, it feels hopeless. It feels like I'm just me banging my head against a wall and hitting one dead end after another. But maybe I won't be doing it alone. If you want to help, please reach out. About a year ago, I started a Patreon page for my video work, and thanks to the support of my producers, I've been able to do 9 video essays and a few little 10-minute video things in that time, despite the fact that I had to move house, write a book, and deal with a game blowing up. So thank you very much for enabling me to concentrate on this work and allow me to make some modest equipment upgrades. If you want to also become a Patreon producer, it's $5 a month for producer credit and $10 a month for double producer credit, where you're listed in the credits twice in a row. Thank you.